Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are in poem number 10 of the 11 poems of the Seadrift section of Leaves of Grass, Patrolling Barnegat. Now, you'll see already that patrolling has a more arcane spelling, and obviously Barnegat, we got to figure out what's going on there. This is one of the few 14-line offerings, so some will call this an actual sonnet in Leaves of Grass. We're going to pay attention to the ways in which this poem and the poem to follow after the sea ship are now bringing to an end this section that started with Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking. Now, our assumptions, speaking of Out of the Cradle, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, down that left-hand side, the Talks with Walt playlist, and that you've been with us all the way from the very opening lines of inscriptions up through and including some introductory comments on Seadrift, and then finally all ships. So let's now turn to some background information in our Nortons for this one. Barnegat was first printed in the American of June 1880, reprinted in Harper's Monthly April 1881, and finally in its present position in Leaves of Grass in 1881. Different manuscript drafts indicate a whole lot of reworking of this poem. Barnegat Bay, a large salt inlet about 30 miles long, is off the coast of Ocean County, New Jersey, where Whitman sometimes visited during his Camden days. Now, again, I want you to pay attention to the present participles that will end all of these: running, muttering, peeling, lashing, careening, slanting. We have seen this game being played. The assonants, the consonants as well. Put it at 2B. We're going to be paying attention to all of this. Now, On the Beach Alone is a 14-line offering as well. We didn't say it at the time, but there's something about this poem that seems to suggest that Whitman is very much about the form of the poem itself. And of course, it's fun to read out loud, as I've told you guys so many times. All of these poems are fun to read aloud. Let's enjoy the poem. Wild, wild the storm and the sea high running, steady the roar of the gale with incessant undertone muttering, shouts of demonic laughter fitfully piercing and pealing, waves, air, midnight, their savagest trinity lashing out in the shadows, their milk-white combs careening, on beachy slush and sand spurts of snow fierce slanting, where through the murk the easterly death wind breasting, through cutting swirl and spray, watchful and firm advancing. That, in the distance, is that a wreck? Is the red signal flaring? Slush and sand of the beach, tireless till daylight winding, steadily, slowly through hoarse roar, never remitting, along the midnight edge by those milk-white combs careening, a group of dim, weird forms struggling, the night confronting, that savage trinity wearily watching. Now, there has been one or two of you guys that have pointed out, you know, this is one of the few poems that somehow seems to sound a lot like Tennyson, to sound a lot like Emily Dickinson, and that's just simply because of some of the intentionality of the sound. And yet I think Whitman is doing some very interesting things here. Notice right away the word wild is stacked, and we're going to see this again in After the Sea Ship, where you have wild, wild the storm. By the way, the word wild will be used for the first time, you'll remember, from starting from Paumanok, passage 18. And the sea high running. Notice the word order. It's not the high sea, it's the sea high running. Steady the roar of the gale, of course, the winds are going to be a big part of this poem, with incessant undertone muttering. Notice the dance between the S sounds, the hard sibilants, and the T sounds. Shouts of demonic laughter fitfully piercing and pealing. We're going to get to this pierce and fierce and hear the internal rhyming that's happening. Waves, air, midnight, and then we're going to call that a trinity, a savagest trinity, which will be, of course, back to the last line again, the savage trinity, lashing out in the shadows. Notice this lashing out can be read, notice how I read it as in lashing out. It can be read as lashing, comma, out in the shadows there. Of course, shadows. Everything's symbolic in this poem as well, right? As we are finishing Seadrift, we're talking about the shadows versus the light. There, milk-white combs careening. We're going to get almost the exact same line down a little bit later at line 12 with careening. By the way, it's interesting that the only use of savage or savages is actually in all the Leaves of Grass is here in this poem. On beachy slush and sand, we've seen this in Seadrift already. Spurts of snow, hear all these S sounds. Fierce, slanting. So hear that from slush, sand, even beachy has an almost S sound to it, right? Slush, sand, spurts, snow, fierce, slanting. All of that is happening. By the way, you'll remember in I Sing the Body Electric, passage 5, the word fierce was used there. Go back and take a look. We've already dealt with it. Where through the murk, lilacs last in the dooryard bloom, number 2 will be the only other time the word murk gets used in this way. The murk, the easterly death wind breasting. By the way, notice all these hyphenated words at the end of Seadrift. We'll start to see it. Death wind, breasting. It is interesting, the word breasting. And you're right. Of course, those of you have said this already. This is kind of an Emily Dickinson-like use of language, no question. Through cutting swirl and spray. Of course, what is it that's cutting? It's almost like it's cutting through you, right? Because it's so cold. Watchful and firm, advancing. And then in parenthetics, to again make us think of Dickinson. That in the distance, exclamation point. Is that a wreck? Obviously, we're patrolling, right? Barnegat. Is the red signal flaring? In other words, is there some concern? Slush and sand of the beach, tireless till daylight. Winding. We're going to hear this word winding, the centenarian story later. Steadily, slowly. Again, notice all these, and notice how the ly will slow down this line. Steadily, slowly, through hoarse roar, never remitting. You'll remember this word horse from Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, right? Hoarse surging of sea. So it's almost like we're going to come back to a word that was utilized at the very beginning of Seadrift. Never remitting. Along the midnight edge, we're back to it at line 4 with midnight. Midnight edge by those milk white combs careening. It was the milk white combs careening of line 5, right? So we're playing that game. A group of dim, and then he uses this word weird, which when we did Song of the Answer, passage 2, we saw it already used. A group of dim, weird forms, and every time the word forms gets used in Whitman, we're always thinking of our Plato's Republic. Struggling, contesting, right? The night confronting, and then we're back to it. That savage trinity warily watching. Again, the only other use of savage is going to be in Lilacs last. The only other use of trinity in Leaves of Grass will be back to Lilacs last in the dooryard bloom, passage 1, trinity sure. The idea that warily, as it's used here in line 14, this is its only use in all of Leaves of Grass. I find that kind of thing quite fascinating. Well, let's finish at 2a. What are we going to say about a poem like this? Well, you can read it obviously literally. That is to say, we're out patrolling. We've got this really dangerous environment, and we're looking for, to try and save. Obviously, there's some religious overtones in that notion. But I think as well this poem is often read and can be read and probably should be read as somehow figuratively speaking about the immortality of the human soul, the unconquerable power of the human soul, the human spirit. Finally, at 2b, finally, is this a sonnet? How do you read it? Do you read it as a sonnet? And then, of course, notice again all of the assonants, the consonants. Obviously, we mentioned all those in words, those present participles as well. At 3a, well, we're going to come back to this in our last comments of the next poem, but I think T.S. Eliot's Dry Salvages, there's a whole lot of this poem in Dry Salvages, and we'll try and prove that to you somewhat. Moby Dick comes to mind, remember 1851. I like to think of the Odyssey as well, because there's such moments in the Odyssey. We've talked about this at other places at learnstrong.net. There's such a number of moments in the Odyssey where there's always this thing about the power of the sea and the fear, of course, of possible death and the like. Finally, at 3b, Are you a lover of the ocean, just to try to connect with this poem? Are you a lover of the ocean? Do you believe in the immortality of the soul? Do you believe in the unconquerable power of the soul, in the immortality of the soul, even in the worst of situations, the terrible storm? Obviously, storms for Whitman can be both literal as well as figurative. Well, we now will turn to the final and the 11th poem and see just how Whitman decides to finish his Sea Drift collection. Thank you.